They came at sunrise with bulldozers to tear down everything he loved. 50 years of sweat, sacrifice, and memories. But as the sun set over the wreckage, the old farmer looked up and saw something no one expected. Thomas Braddock had always known this day might come, but nothing could prepare a man for the sight of strangers stepping off a fleet of trucks, wearing crisp suits and carrying clipboards. He was 71, a retired farmer and Marine Corps veteran, and he stood on the porch of the house he'd built with his own hands, gripping the railing to steady the tremor in his gut. The property stretched across 30 acres of rolling fields, golden and stubborn in the June light. He'd harvested corn here for 40 years. He'd watched his children grow tall as the stalks, watched them leave, watched the seasons roll through in their own silent ceremony. Every fence post, every weathered plank of the barn held a memory, and now the developers claimed it was all theirs. A man in a slim gray jacket stepped forward, his shoes sinking into the dewy grass. He had the careful voice of someone who'd practiced sounding sympathetic without meaning it. "Mr. Braddock," he called, "I'm afraid we're here to execute the order. You've had adequate notice." Thomas didn't reply. He looked past the man to the convoy behind him. Flatbed trucks, security officers, and a bulldozer idling like a beast on a leash. The engines hummed over the low drone of insects waking up in the grass. He thought of Ruth, his wife, gone 4 winters ago. She would have been standing beside him, her hand tucked into the crook of his elbow. He felt the ache of her absence as a new kind of loneliness, deeper than he'd ever known. His throat tightened, but he forced his voice to come steady. "This land is paid off," he said. "I settled every debt. You've got no right." The man sighed, as if he were the one burdened by the injustice of it. "There was a lien placed against the property after your son defaulted on his business loan. You co-signed the paperwork, sir. Legally, the bank had the right to sell the debt. The developers purchased it fair and square." Thomas knew the words were true. He'd signed those papers for his boy, believing he was helping him start fresh. Now, everything he had left was being hauled away because of that signature. A security guard shifted closer, his expression blank. "I'm going to have to ask you to gather your belongings," he said quietly. Thomas looked past them all, out to the fields glistening under first light. He thought about the calluses on his hands, the way the earth had always answered back when he worked it. He thought about the neighbors who'd brought over casseroles after Ruth passed, the old veterans from town who'd sat with him through the worst nights. He'd never asked for much, just a patch of land to tend until he couldn't walk it anymore. His voice cracked. "You don't know what you're taking," he said. The man didn't answer. He turned, gestured to the others, and the bulldozer rumbled to life. Thomas felt his knees go weak, but he stood his ground, watching as the machine rolled forward. It stopped a few yards from the porch, the operator waiting for the all-clear. The hum of diesel was the soundtrack to his heartbreak. It took less than 20 minutes to clear the first outbuildings. They splintered under the blade, old sheds that had housed tools and tractors and memories. Dust rose in curling plumes. Thomas kept thinking he should feel rage, something hot enough to set fire to the whole damn procession, but all he felt was the slow, cavernous ache of loss. When it was over, one of the younger men approached with a cardboard box. "You can take anything you want from the house before we board it up," he said, not meeting Thomas's eyes. Thomas nodded. His boots felt like they weighed 100 pounds as he crossed the porch and stepped inside. The kitchen was still neat, just as Ruth had left it. Checked curtains, chipped mugs, the old radio she'd listened to every morning. He set the box on the table and stood there, hands trembling. His wedding photo, the folded flag from his service, Ruth's worn Bible. He packed them one by one, each object a wound reopened. Out in the yard, the suits conferred in low voices. Paperwork shuffled in their hands. The young security guard lingered near the door, shifting from foot to foot as if he knew this was wrong, but didn't have the courage to say it. Thomas carried the box to his truck, parked under the big oak tree that shaded the driveway. He glanced back once. The farmhouse stood dignified in its last dawn, paint peeling, windows catching the sun. It looked smaller than it had ever looked to him, like something fragile and temporary. He didn't look again when he started the engine. As he pulled away, he felt something break loose in his chest, a grief so sharp it took his breath. But beneath it, almost hidden, was something else. A small, defiant spark he thought he'd lost long ago. He drove into town without a plan, without a place to sleep, without the woman who would have known what to say. But Thomas Braddock was a Marine. He had survived worse than this. And as he turned onto Main Street past the diner and the post office, he knew one thing with clarity. He would not let them erase him without a fight. Word spread faster than Thomas expected. By the time he pulled into the gravel lot behind the American Legion Hall, he could see the silhouettes of men and women gathering by the side door, cups of coffee steaming in their hands. The hall had always been a place of unspoken solidarity, a refuge for veterans who understood the kinds of scars that didn't show up on the skin. As he stepped out of the truck, the morning sun broke over the rooftops, gilding the cracked asphalt and the line of American flags fluttering on their poles. It almost made the day look ordinary. Almost. The first to greet him was Leo Mendoza, a Korean war vet with a limp that never healed right. Leo had been a fixture at every Memorial Day parade, stoic in the front row, his old uniform still pressed crisp. He was 76 now, but the fire in his eyes was unchanged. "Tom," Leo said, his voice roughened by age and cigarettes. "We heard." Thomas swallowed, trying to find the words. He didn't want to cry here, not in front of these men who had faced bullets and loss without complaint. But when he opened his mouth, his voice broke anyway. "They tore it down, Leo," he said. "All of it." Leo's jaw tightened. A murmur passed through the small crowd behind him, familiar faces from the neighborhood, men and women Thomas had known for decades. Hank Spivey, who'd farmed the next parcel over before selling to the same developers. May Jenkins, who'd cooked meals for every funeral in town. Pete Holloway, a Vietnam vet whose grandson had played in Thomas's haylofts. A woman stepped forward. She wore jeans and a denim jacket with the county extension logo stitched over the pocket. Her hair was pulled into a no-nonsense bun, and her eyes were sharp as cut glass. "Mr. Braddock, I'm Karen O'Neill," she said. "I work with the Rural Land Justice Initiative. May called me this morning." He looked at May, who nodded gravely. Thomas drew a breath, feeling the old pride stir in his ribs. Maybe he wasn't alone after all. "They had the paperwork," he said quietly. "My son, he—" Karen lifted a hand. "I read the filings already. Your son defaulted. The lien was attached to the property, but that doesn't mean the eviction was legal. Developers have a habit of cutting corners when they think no one's watching." Thomas frowned. "It was all so fast." Karen nodded. "That's what they count on, catching people off guard. But you've got rights, Mr. Braddock, and you've got witnesses." Leo shifted closer. "We'll back you up," he said gruffly. "Every last one of us." Something loosened in Thomas's chest. It wasn't quite relief. Nothing could undo what he'd lost. But it felt like the first breath he'd been able to take in hours. "I don't have money for lawyers," he said. Karen gave him a small, fierce smile. "That's why I'm here. We work pro bono for cases like yours. If we can prove procedural violations, or that you weren't properly informed, you might be able to stop demolition and recover damages." He looked past her to the others standing shoulder to shoulder in the morning light. They looked older than he remembered. Frailer. But in that moment, they looked unbreakable. "I don't know what to say," he murmured. "Don't say anything yet," Karen replied. "Just let us help." They led him inside, where the air smelled of stale coffee and old wood polish. A few more people drifted in. Neighbors who'd heard what happened, veterans who remembered him from fundraisers and parades. The hall had never looked so full. Karen spread out paperwork on a folding table. Leo set a coffee in front of Thomas. May laid a hand on his shoulder and squeezed gently. "Start at the beginning," Karen said, pen poised. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment. He pictured Ruth standing in the kitchen, her hand over his on the table. He pictured the fields at dawn, the barn, the oak tree that shaded the driveway. His throat tightened, but when he opened his eyes, his voice was clear. "I bought that land when I was 26, he began. "My father left me a little inheritance from the hardware business. I wanted a place to raise my family. I never thought I'd leave." He talked for an hour. About the seasons, the harvests, the day he and Ruth moved in. About signing the loan for his son, never imagining that kindness would be the weapon turned against him. As he spoke, the pain edged away, replaced by a steadier determination. When he finished, Karen looked him square in the eye. "Mr. Braddock, I can't promise we'll win," she said, "but I promise we'll fight." Thomas nodded, feeling something rise in him he thought was gone. Hope. He reached for his coffee with hands that didn't tremble so badly anymore. Outside, a breeze rustled the flags along the sidewalk, and for the first time all day, he felt the ground under his feet belonged to him again. Thomas left the Legion Hall feeling steadier, though the ache in his chest hadn't dulled. The air was warm by then, soft with early summer, and as he stepped outside he could almost pretend it was an ordinary morning. But the truth pressed in from all sides. His farm was no longer his. His house was boarded up, and everything he'd worked for had been reduced to rubble. Still, as he walked to his truck, he felt something shift in him, a quiet resolve that made it easier to stand tall. Karen had insisted on making copies of all his documents. "You're going to need a paper trail," she'd said. "Everything you've got. Deeds, letters, notices, anything that proves how long you've been there." It felt strange to think that the life he'd built could be condensed into manila folders and notarized signatures. But he understood now that sometimes survival came down to the smallest proofs. When he turned onto Main Street, he saw more cars than usual outside the diner. He considered driving past, but habit tugged him to the curb. The diner had been part of his life for 40 years. Coffee with neighbors, Sunday breakfasts after church, late-night stops during harvest. It felt right to go inside, even if he didn't feel much like talking. A bell jingled as he pushed the door open. Heads turned. For a heartbeat, the place fell quiet. Then the voices started. Soft greetings, murmurs of sympathy, a few hands raised in solemn acknowledgement. He didn't want pity, but he wasn't ashamed to accept their kindness. He made his way to the counter where Betty Raines was wiping down the coffee machine. She was in her 60s now, her hair silver and piled high on her head. She'd run this place since her husband passed, and she had a way of making everyone feel like family. "Morning, Thomas," she said, her voice gentle. "Come sit. You look like you could use something hot." "Thank you, Betty," he said, lowering himself onto the stool. His legs felt leaden. She poured him a cup of coffee without asking and set it in front of him. "Word got around," she said softly. "We're all real sorry." Thomas nodded, staring into the cup. He didn't trust his voice. A moment later he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Pete Holloway standing there, his weathered face drawn tight. "Tom," Pete said gruffly, "some of us been talking." Thomas blinked. "About what?" Pete shifted, glancing at Betty and then back at Thomas. about how we're not going to let them do this without a fight. You've been here longer than any of them. You built that place." Thomas felt something stutter in his chest, part disbelief, part gratitude. "I don't know what you can do." Pete pulled out the stool beside him. "Well, we can start by showing them you're not alone. You know how many veterans live around here? How many folks your farm's fed over the years?" Thomas did know, though he'd never thought about it that way. He'd always just tried to be a good neighbor, to help when he could. It never occurred to him that all those small kindnesses might come back to stand beside him. Betty leaned in. "We thought maybe we'd organize something. A meeting. A fundraiser if you need it." "A fundraiser?" he echoed, stunned. "People want to help," she said simply. "You'd do it for any of us." His throat tightened. He looked down at his hands, scarred, calloused, familiar. He'd spent a lifetime relying on them. Now he was learning to let other people's hands catch him when he fell. "I don't know what to say," he managed. "You don't have to say anything yet," Pete told him. "Just let us work on it." Thomas nodded slowly. Around them, the diner came back to life. Orders called out, plates clattering, the radio humming low in the background. But a hush still seemed to hang around his little circle, as if they were drawing a line around him that no bulldozer could cross. Betty reached over and patted his hand. "You finish that coffee. Then you go home with Pete. You shouldn't be alone tonight." Thomas wanted to protest, to insist he was fine. But he wasn't fine. He was tired and raw, and the idea of going back to an empty cab felt unbearable. "All right," he said softly. Outside, the sky was the bright blue of a day that didn't care about any man's troubles. But as Thomas looked through the window at the street he'd driven 1,000 times, he felt something steady take root. This wasn't over. He hadn't fought through wars and droughts and the loss of Ruth just to surrender. He'd find a way, even if he had to lean on the people who loved him, even if it humbled him to do it. He'd fight. That evening, Thomas sat at Pete Holloway's kitchen table while the sunset streaked the sky in bruised purple and orange. The farmhouse was old but clean, the air rich with the smell of stew and fresh bread. Pete's wife, Linda, had insisted he eat something, pressing a bowl into his hands as soon as he walked through the door. He'd tried to protest, but she'd shushed him with a look so kind he didn't have the heart to argue. The Holloway's kitchen felt like a place time hadn't touched. Flowered curtains, chipped formica counters, a wooden hutch lined with family photos. Thomas sat back in the chair and felt, for a moment, like he was safe again. Like the world hadn't shifted under his feet. Pete settled across from him, his big hands folded over a stack of folded newspapers. For a while, they didn't speak. They didn't have to. The comfort came in the quiet, in the knowledge that neither of them had to pretend. It was Linda who finally broke the hush, sitting down between them. "I called Reverend Marks," she said gently. "He wants to know if you'd be all right with him mentioning your situation at Sunday service." Thomas felt the heat rise in his cheeks. "I don't want charity," he said gruffly. "No one's calling it charity," Pete said. "Folks want to stand by you, Tom. You spent your whole life showing up for everyone else. Let us return the favor." Thomas looked at his old friend and then at Linda, her eyes bright with quiet resolve. He swallowed hard. "If you think it will help," he said finally. Linda reached across the table and gave his hand a squeeze. "It will." They talked then, in fits and starts, about what came next. Karen O'Neill had promised to draw up paperwork in the morning, letters of protest, filings for injunctions, requests for discovery. It all sounded impossibly complicated, but Thomas trusted her more than he trusted himself in that moment. When the meal was finished and the dishes cleared away, Pete leaned back with a sigh. "You know," he said, "I was thinking about that big veterans benefit down at the Civic Center. They've been looking for a cause to tie it to this year. Maybe if we can get your story in the paper." "I don't want to be some sob story," Thomas cut in, sharper than he meant to. Pete held up a hand. "I know. But sometimes you have to show people what's happening right in front of them. Not everyone knows how developers work. Not everyone sees the fine print until it's too late." Thomas pinched the bridge of his nose. He felt so tired, his bones heavy with all the years behind him. But when he looked up and met Pete's gaze, he knew his friend was right. He couldn't fight this alone, and he couldn't fight it in silence. "All right," he said after a moment. "Let them write what they want. If it helps other folks keep their land, it's worth it." Linda smiled and rose to her feet. "Good," she said. "Then tomorrow we start making calls." They insisted he take the guest room. "It's too late to be driving back to town," Linda said firmly. He didn't argue. The truth was, he didn't think he could bear to go back to the parking lot where he'd planned to spend the night in his truck. The thought of that dark cab, of waking alone to another dawn of loss, made his chest seize up. In the small, tidy bedroom, he sat on the edge of the quilted bedspread. The walls were lined with framed photos: Pete and Linda's wedding, their kids in Little League uniforms, snapshots from picnics and parades, ordinary happiness, captured forever. He stared at those pictures and felt the ache of everything he'd lost. But he also felt a thread of something steadier, something he hadn't dared name all day. Hope. He opened the box he'd carried from the farm. Carefully, he set Ruth's Bible on the nightstand and placed the folded flag beside it. When he smoothed his hand over the flag's creased surface, the memories rose up so strong he could hardly breathe. The night he brought it home, Ruth had cried in the doorway. Not because she was afraid. She'd known he was coming back, but because she was proud. Because she believed in what that flag stood for: sacrifice, honor, duty. He sat there a long time, the flag in his lap, his rough palms tracing the stars. And for the first time since the Bulldozers came, Thomas Braddock allowed himself to imagine a future. Not the one he'd planned, maybe, but a future that belonged to him just the same. Outside the window, the last light faded from the fields. He closed his eyes and thought of Ruth's voice, soft in his ear. The county courthouse was a red brick building that Thomas had only ever visited to pay taxes or renew paperwork, never for anything like this. As he climbed the wide steps with Karen beside him, he felt the weight of it pressing down, a reminder that his life was no longer private, no longer simple. Inside, the hallways smelled of old paper and floor wax. Clerks moved briskly from counter to counter, phones ringing over the low hum of voices. Thomas felt out of place among all the suited professionals, but Karen gave his arm a reassuring squeeze. "You belong here as much as any of them," she said softly. "Don't forget that." He nodded, though the knot in his stomach didn't loosen. He'd faced harder things: war zones, drought, grief, but something about this was worse. It was the helplessness. The way men in crisp shirts could reduce a life to paperwork and signatures. They reached the clerk's office, where Karen laid out her documents with calm precision. The woman behind the counter, who wore thick glasses and a patient expression, scanned the forms carefully. "We'll process this immediately," she said, stamping the top page. "If the judge agrees to the injunction, you'll be notified by tomorrow morning." Thomas found he'd been holding his breath. He let it out slowly, feeling a small, fragile relief. Karen thanked the clerk and gathered her files. As they walked back down the steps, she turned to him with an almost conspiratorial smile. "You've already won half the battle," she said. "You made them look you in the eye. That counts for something." Thomas shook his head. I'm not sure it feels like winning. Karen's expression softened. It never does. Not at first. But standing up is how it starts. They stepped out into the bright morning, and Thomas was surprised to see a small crowd waiting near the sidewalk. Pete was there and Betty from the diner. 2 local reporters held cameras at their sides, not yet raised. A couple of men Thomas recognized from the veterans' breakfast nodded solemnly as he approached. Pete stepped forward and clapped him on the shoulder. "Told you people would show up," he said, grinning. Thomas swallowed hard, overcome by a gratitude too big for words. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Betty said, pressing a hand over his. "We're here because you matter." The reporters asked for a statement, and Karen handled most of it, explaining the injunction and why it mattered for small farmers across the county. But when one of them turned to Thomas and asked, "What would you say to the developers?" he found the words came easier than he expected. "I'd say I'm not going anywhere," he said simply. "I've been here my whole life, and it'll take more than a piece of paper to make me disappear." It was the first time he'd felt like himself since the Bulldozers came. As the crowd began to disperse, Pete fell into step beside him. "Come on back to the Legion," he said. "A couple of the guys from the Post are putting together a fund. They're calling it Save the Braddock Farm." Thomas stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, too stunned to speak. "A fund?" Pete nodded. "They already have pledges coming in. Some folks want to help cover legal costs. Others just want you to know you're not alone." The thought of it, the neighbors he'd known for decades, the veterans who'd carried their own burdens, strangers who'd read his story in the paper, it humbled him so deeply he had to look away. "Pete," he managed, voice rough, "I can't let people—" "You're not letting us do anything," Pete interrupted firmly. "We're choosing to." For a long moment, Thomas just stood there, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face, the quiet solidarity of 100 unseen hands holding him up. And in that moment, he knew he would never again mistake survival for weakness. When they reached the Legion Hall, it was already buzzing with activity. Tables had been pushed together, papers spread across them, coffee brewing in big metal urns. A hand-painted sign leaned against the wall, letters uneven but proud. "Stand with Tom. Save our farms." Thomas stopped in the doorway, overcome. For all the loss he'd carried, all the bitterness he'd swallowed, this was something he hadn't dared hope for. Community, rising up in his defense. Karen squeezed his arm. "This is how we win," she whispered, "one neighbor at a time." He nodded, feeling something steady take root inside him, a promise to the land, to Ruth's memory, to every man and woman who'd refused to let him fall alone. He stepped into the hall, shoulders back, ready to begin again. The next morning dawned hazy and cool. The sun slow to rise over the fields that once belonged to Thomas Braddock. He'd slept at Pete and Linda's again, too wound up to face the silence of his truck cab. When he woke, he lay still for a long time, listening to the creaks of the old farmhouse and the low murmur of voices drifting up from the kitchen. It felt almost like being young again, before the weight of responsibility had settled on his shoulders. But when he opened his eyes and saw Ruth's Bible on the nightstand, the ache returned. Some losses you carried forever. He rose slowly, washed his face in the little bathroom, and dressed in clean work pants and his best denim shirt. Today, the judge's decision about the injunction would come in. One way or another, he would know if there was still hope of saving the last piece of what he'd built. Downstairs, the kitchen was already alive with motion. Linda was ladling oatmeal into bowls, Pete was pouring coffee, and Karen sat at the table with her laptop open, reading from the screen. "You're up," Karen said, her voice calm but tinged with urgency. "I just got an email from the clerk's office." Thomas felt his heart stutter. He pulled out a chair, bracing himself. And? Karen looked up and smiled. We got the injunction. Effective immediately. No further demolition or removal of property is allowed until the court reviews the case. For a second, he didn't understand the words. Then, as they sank in, he felt the air rush out of his lungs. Relief flooded through him so fast it made him lightheaded. It's not a final victory, Karen cautioned, but it means your home is safe, at least for now. Linda let out a little cheer and clapped her hands together. Pete grinned and thumped Thomas's shoulder. See, Pete said, you stand up to bullies, they find out they're not as powerful as they think. Thomas set his hands flat on the table to steady them. He had never asked for much from life, just enough. A piece of land to tend, a roof over his head, the quiet dignity of earning what he had. The developers hadn't just tried to take his farm, they'd tried to erase that dignity. And today, he'd reclaimed a piece of it. By late morning, news of the injunction had spread. Cars began to trickle into the gravel lot outside the Legion Hall. Neighbors came carrying envelopes and casserole dishes, offering donations and warm words. Local veterans arrived in uniform, their faces solemn, their presence a kind of silent testimony. Betty from the diner stood on a chair and called the room to order. All right, everyone, she said, voice ringing clear. We're here because we know this isn't just Tom's fight. It's every family farm's fight. Developers are betting we'll stay quiet and look away. Let's prove them wrong. A cheer went up. Thomas, standing near the doorway, felt his throat tighten. He'd never been comfortable with attention. But as he looked around the hall, at the old men in their faded caps, the young families balancing toddlers on their hips, the neighbors who'd been part of his life for 40 years, he understood that this wasn't about attention. It was about belonging, about saying, we see you, we won't let you be erased. Karen stepped forward to explain the next steps: filings for damages, motions to challenge the foreclosure, appeals that could take months. But Thomas found he didn't mind the uncertainty. He'd lived long enough to know that nothing worth keeping was ever won without a fight. When she finished, the room fell into a quiet murmur of conversation. Donations were counted, volunteers signed up to help with paperwork and outreach, and someone passed out homemade flyers with the words, "Protect our farms, protect our neighbors." Pete came to stand beside him, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. "Looks like you started something," he said, passing one over. Thomas took it, feeling the heat seep into his palms. "I didn't start anything," he said softly. "I just didn't back down." Pete smiled. "That's all it takes." They stood together at the edge of the hall, watching as neighbors embraced, as volunteers made phone calls, as kids helped stack boxes of supplies. For the first time since the Bulldozers came, Thomas didn't feel like a man who'd lost everything. He felt like a man who still had roots. And maybe, just maybe, those roots were deeper than the developers would ever understand. As the afternoon light slanted through the windows, painting the floor in golden rectangles, Thomas closed his eyes and felt Ruth's memory settle around him like a blessing. "We can start over, Tom. We always have." And so he would. Tomorrow, and the day after that, for as long as it took. 2 weeks later, Thomas Braddock stood in front of the old oak at the edge of what used to be his cornfield. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky in bands of gold and rose, the branches overhead casting long shadows across the grass. The injunction had held. For now, at least, the developers were barred from any further action. The legal battle was far from over. Karen reminded him of that every time they spoke. But something fundamental had shifted. People were paying attention. The crowd that gathered beneath the oak wasn't huge, but it was steady. Neighbors, farmers from other counties who'd read the story and driven miles to shake his hand. veterans with their caps pulled low, eyes bright with quiet understanding. Even the local politicians had turned up, though they mostly kept to the edges of the crowd, wary of looking opportunistic. At the foot of the oak, someone had hammered a handmade sign into the dirt. This land matters. This man matters. Thomas read those words and felt the burn of tears behind his eyes. He wasn't a man who cried easily. He'd been taught to swallow his feelings, to keep his chin up and his back straight. But tonight, he didn't feel ashamed to stand here with his heart showing. Karen stepped up beside him and laid a hand lightly on his arm. "They're asking if you'd say a few words," she murmured. He looked at her bewildered. "Me? You," she said, smiling. "You're why they're here." Thomas swallowed, trying to steady himself. He wasn't a speechmaker. He was just a farmer, a husband, a father who'd done his best and sometimes failed. But when he looked out over that sea of familiar faces, he realized this was the moment to speak. He took a slow breath and stepped forward until he stood by the sign. The breeze rustled the grass, carrying the faint smell of freshly turned earth. For a moment he imagined Ruth standing just behind him, her hand warm on his back, steadying him the way she always had. He cleared his throat, and the crowd fell quiet. "I never thought I'd be here," he began, his voice low but strong. "Never thought I'd stand in front of my neighbors and ask for anything. All my life I tried to handle things myself, to be the man people could rely on." He paused, his gaze sweeping the gathering. "When they came with their bulldozers, I thought that was the end. I thought everything Ruth and I built was gone. And for a while, I was ready to let it be gone. I was tired. I was ashamed that I'd signed that loan. Ashamed that my mistakes cost me everything." A murmur rippled through the crowd, soft, sympathetic. "But then," he said, voice roughening, "you all showed up. You called. You sent letters. You stood beside me when I couldn't stand by myself. And you reminded me that a farm isn't just acres of land. It's every hand that ever helped plant a seed. Every neighbor who showed up with a meal. Every friend who says, 'We won't let them take you without a fight.'" The breeze lifted again, fluttering the edges of his shirt. "I don't know what's going to happen next," he admitted. "I can't promise we'll win. But I can promise I won't stop fighting. Because this isn't just about me. It's about all of us. About what we owe to the land and each other." Silence fell, deep and thick and full of something almost sacred. Then, from somewhere near the front, Pete started to clap. Slowly, others joined in, until the applause rolled over him in a wave he could barely take in. Thomas bowed his head, pressing a hand to his chest. He felt humbled to his bones, and stronger for it. When the clapping faded, Karen leaned in. "You did good," she said quietly. He managed a smile. "I don't know about that." "I do." As darkness settled over the fields, lanterns were lit one by one, casting pools of warm light across the grass. People lingered, talking, offering donations, making plans to canvass other farms in danger. And for the first time in weeks, Thomas felt like he could breathe without the weight of shame closing off his lungs. At the end of the evening, he stood alone beneath the oak, the lanterns flickering around him. He laid his hand on the rough bark, remembering the day he'd planted this tree with Ruth, a sapling so thin he could have snapped it with 2 fingers. They'd said it would never grow in the clay soil. But it had. It had rooted itself, weathered storms, and reached toward the sky all the same. He closed his eyes and let the memory fill him with something fierce and bright. "We can start over, Tom. We always have." He opened his eyes and looked out across the fields. They didn't belong to him on paper anymore, but in his heart, They always would. And he knew without doubt he would spend the rest of his days defending them. Because dignity wasn't something you inherited. It was something you reclaimed, one hard day at a time. If you were moved by Thomas's story, please consider subscribing to this channel for more true stories of resilience, community, and quiet acts of justice. Together, we can keep these voices alive.